Final Fantasy 16 is a massive home run for Yoshi-P and the developers over at Creative Business Unit 3. They've aimed for the moon, but they reached the stars with this game, and I could not be any happier with the end product. It's been so many painstakingly long years since they announced that Yoshi-P was going to be leading the development of this game, with Soken making the music and the lead combat designer for Devil May Cry 5, Ryota Suzuki, designing the combat. This was like assembling the Avengers of game development because these guys are legendary for their work in the gaming industry. Especially Yoshi-P, who quite literally saved Final Fantasy XIV from the brink of shutdown and turned it into one of the best MMOs out right now. His work on Final Fantasy XIV was so profound that it became one of my personal favorite MMOs of all time. It was even the reason why I started this whole channel in the first place. If you go back to my very first video on this channel, it was a review on the Endwalker expansion back when it released a few years ago. And here we are now, still reviewing games. Man, it's been a good minute. Anyway, with the help of Yoshi-P's direction, Creative Business Unit 3 were able to release banger after banger expansions. First with Heaven's Ward, then Stormblood, which was admittedly not as good, but still good nonetheless. Then releasing two absolute masterpieces of video game narratives in a row that were the Shadowbringers and Endwalker expansions. From a disaster at launch to one of the best in its genre, this game had one of the biggest redemption arcs in gaming history within the past 10 years. What also amazed me was just how much of a cool guy Yoshi-P is. He understands his player base at a fundamental level and genuinely listens to the feedback that people give him, frequently attending fan meetups and answering their questions in live Q&As. Because of this, he has become one of the GOATs of video game development. So when I heard that Yoshi-P and his studio Creative Business Unit 3 were developing Final Fantasy 16, I had full confidence that this would be an amazing game. In fact, I had so much confidence in this game that I bought a PS5 because I found out this game was going to be a PlayStation exclusive. I was even going to buy the $350 collector's edition until I realized I got the digital version of the PS5. Anyways, now that Final Fantasy 16 is launched, does it live up to all the hype that's been building up for all these years? The hype that all of the marketing and the really good demo generated? Well, after taking about 55 hours beating the game, doing all the side quests, completing all of the hunts, and taking in the sights, I would say yes. Yes, it absolutely does 100%. And not only does it deliver on the promises that I made beforehand, it also goes above and beyond what I ever could have expected from a Final Fantasy game, period. Final Fantasy 16 is a masterpiece in narrative writing, in combat, in world building, in music. This game excels at the core elements it set out to accomplish with flying colors. This is one of the best games to release this year, and it's already a pretty stacked year as it is. The developers over at Creative Business Unit 3 have promised a gripping story with deep characters and adrenaline-rushing combat, and they've given us exactly that. This is their love letter to the Final Fantasy franchise, and I could not be any happier with how this game turned out because this is an amazing experience for both old and new fans alike. Now, a bit of a disclaimer here, Final Fantasy 16 is not really an RPG, nor does it have any of the classic Final Fantasy gameplay elements like party management, elemental affinities, and build diversity. I feel like I need to say this because a lot of people seem to be really disappointed by this game because they had some preconceived expectations going into this game. They were expecting this game to be something completely different than what it actually is, and once they found out that this was not the game that they wanted, those people were sort of understandably upset, saying that this wasn't a Final Fantasy game because it was missing some features. Well, after putting a good 50 plus hours into this game, I would say that this feels very Final Fantasy. In my opinion, the term Final Fantasy is kinda nebulous and it takes on many different meanings. There is no real definition of what a Final Fantasy game should be, it's just sort of a feeling you get when playing the games. Some may say that true Final Fantasies are turn-based, others may say that they need to have party and item management. The thing is, Final Fantasy has always been a series that's evolved after every iteration, leaving behind some disillusioned fans every single time. Some people were upset when the series made a transition from 2D to 3D, others were frustrated when it stopped being turn-based. And now we see the same thing here with 16 removing some long-time RPG elements and streamlining many aspects. You see, there is no right or wrong answer when it comes to what makes a Final Fantasy game. It really just comes down to the individual's interpretation of it. So if you don't think this game fits your personal description for whatever reason, then that's completely fine. But I personally don't think the feeling of a Final Fantasy game comes from the gameplay mechanics, but from how the universe is built using the same pieces of lore. It's why most of the mainline Final Fantasy games include the use of Eikons and some sort of world-ending plot where you have to kill a godlike being. Final Fantasy has always been about the grand adventures and the deep personal stories with a touch of anime-like absurdity to it. I know that seems like a broad definition because a lot of games fit that box, but you can't really apply logic to a feeling. And based on that vague criteria, I'd say that even though 16 made some huge sweeping changes that normally would have been blasphemy in the past, this game feels very Final Fantasy and it still hits all of the core points that made this series so lovable in the first place. Final Fantasy XVI made a really bold decision to go for a more mature setting for a mainline title. This is pretty much uncharted territory because the only other M-rated Final Fantasies in the past were Stranger of Paradise and Type 0, both being spin-offs, which would make this the first ever mainline Final Fantasy game to ever have an M rating. And I think this is a really smart design choice because the Final Fantasy franchise is really old, and many of the fans who grew up playing the older games like Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy X in their childhood have all pretty much become full-grown adults now. So making the decision to tell a more mature game that tells a darker story with more nuanced concepts was a decision made to cater to the older fans of the series. This darker tonal shift opens up this game to tell so many more grim stories with more adult themes. When people were saying this game's story was like Game of Thrones, they weren't kidding. The world of Valisthea is not a happy place. There is lots of death, slavery, and war going on in this universe set in the medieval fantasy. The game takes on a more grim atmosphere than previous Final Fantasy titles, and this is such a breath of fresh air because the world building is a lot more interesting now that they can explore more mature themes. Every little side quest and dialogue in this game gives a little more context to the things that happen around in Valisthea, like how bearers are treated by society or how the blight and ether floods affect the areas around it. Everything here just adds to the immersion of this extremely rich and expansive world. Now, a common criticism about how this game does its world building is that it's done in these very boring and expository dialogue scenes where nothing is happening on the screen for what seems like forever. And after doing all the side quests in this game, I kinda agree with this sentiment. A lot of the side quests and even some of the main quest dialogues are really dull and uneventful. Like, there's a side quest where you literally just deliver food to random NPCs. That's it. Most of these aren't really interesting narratively or mechanically even, and just serve to flesh out the world and the characters living in it. And it kinda makes more sense why the devs did the quest the way they did when you factor in the fact that they've pretty much only worked on MMOs for the past decade. And it really puts into perspective why a lot of them feel like MMO filler, because they are. If you've ever played FF14 before, you can kinda see the same MMO-like design philosophies CBU3 had in this game. Like, when you talk to an NPC in one cutscene just to walk 10 feet and talk to another. Not saying this is a good thing, but it makes sense why they did it this way. Thankfully, however, the side quests do get better later on in the game with actual interesting storylines and satisfying conclusions. If you're a lore fanatic like I am, then you'll probably enjoy the side quests a little more than the average player. But other than that, a lot of people will probably end up skipping them altogether because of how boring and unrewarding they usually are. Some of these side quests have dialogue scenes that last for several minutes at a time. A lot of these quests felt like they were droning on and on for what seems like an eternity. To add on top of that, a lot of the quests aren't very rewarding. You'll maybe get some gills, some XP, and maybe some ability points or crafting materials if you're lucky. I just find it really unfortunate that most of the rewards are so bad because there's a lot of really good world building here that's overshadowed by the bland MMO quest design. But funny enough, we then get quests like this. Koji Fox, is there something you're trying to tell us here? And I've never realized until about halfway through the game, but 16's world and lore is actually really deep. Just like how CBU3 created an extensive universe for Final Fantasy XIV, they've also made 16's lore as vast as an ocean. There are so many different characters, events, and storylines happening here that would be enough to fill a small library. This is a lore fanatic's paradise, and any casual lore enjoyer trying to learn everything would be understandably overloaded with the sheer amount of information. Luckily though, this game has a really good lore compendium and multiple diagrams that have detailed explanations of each character, object, and event in chronological order. I feel like I have to mention this because the developers have really put in a lot of effort into giving the players the information to learn more about this world without having to watch a 30-minute lore video or go dig through some obscure Wikipedia pages for it. You have the active time lore that dynamically changes based on the current relevant events in the story. You have Vivian Ninetales, who gives you the full character relationship diagram and state of the realm chart that changes every time something new happens within the main and side quests. Then there's Harpocrates, who's pretty much the in-game Wikipedia page with the complete history of every character and object that you've ever discovered. It's actually really cool the lengths CBU3 went in order to give the players the necessary tools to learn more about 16's universe. A lot of developers should implement stuff like this in game where players can find out more about the lore and history of the game without having to look it up, because it just makes for an all-around smoother experience. Anyways, the world of Valisthea itself is really beautiful despite its grim dark setting. The visual fidelity of this game is absolutely breathtaking because of how much detail the artists have put into the environments. Each of the areas are visually diverse, from the lush forest of Rosaria to the big open fields of Sambrek to the blazing hot sands of Dhalmekia. There are just so many different areas with their own unique landmarks that make them really stand out from one another. And when you combine these extremely detailed and beautiful backdrops with the god tier OST from Soken, then what you get is an incredibly immersive experience. Almost every moment in this game is screenshotable, which made me have to stop adventuring every so often just to take in the sights of the many jaw-dropping vistas. And even though they aren't that big, the many different settlements that you visit throughout the game are all teeming with life. It feels like people are actually living these places with how they go about their daily lives and how they comment on the events going on in the story. It makes you feel like your actions are actually affecting the world around you when you visit these settlements each time. This may seem like such a small thing, but this helps so much in immersing the player within this world. Although I would have liked a little more party banter while you were out exploring in the world. Most of the time your party members are completely silent even though you fought a hard boss or discovered something new. And it was so jarring how none of the characters really talk to each other outside of scripted moments. It would have been nice to hear some small talk between the characters here and there, as it would have made the party members feel more lively and the game less lonely. Anyways, some people will criticize this game for being linear. I myself don't really mind as long as the developers are able to fully realize their vision of the game. And if the game needs to be linear in order for them to be able to finish everything in a timely manner, then so be it. A problem with this world, however, is that there's no incentive to explore what little play space we get. And it's a bummer because these maps will have a bunch of these little side areas, but when you explore them, you'll find that there's very little there, which makes exploration feel really pointless, and I, as well as many other people, just ended up not doing it altogether because it felt like a waste of time. These side quests were really just made for hunts and side quests. Other than that, they're pretty much mostly empty or unrewarding, which really sucks. If the developers wanted to make these off the beaten path areas, then they should have added more incentives to explore, because as it is now, not many people want to do it. Now, to fill this vast and expansive world of Valisthea are the multitudes of deep and memorable characters that are all interwoven into this really intriguing story of personal conflict and warring nations. Everyone has their own individual role to play in the story, each with believable ambitions and internal struggles of their own that do such an excellent job of fleshing out this diverse cast of personalities. Each of them with their own little character arcs that make them so much more memorable. Like Cid, who's probably one of the best renditions of Cid in a Final Fantasy game because of how integral he is to Clive's character development and how he's such a chill, laid-back dude. Or Jill, who is used as a weapon of war by the Iron Kingdom for 13 years and has to live with the regret of taking so many lives. Even the antagonist characters like Barnabas don't really feel like they're just mustache-twirling villains that just want to be evil for the sake of it, but instead are driven by their own personal motivations that don't necessarily revolve around the protagonist, which makes them much more believable. And the main protagonist himself, Clive, is probably one of the best protagonists in the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. I grew really attached to him throughout my time with this game because of how relatable and vulnerable he is. At first, it might seem like he's the typical edgy, brooding, silent type, but that couldn't be any further from the truth because Clive is an amazingly well-developed character. He goes through so many trials and tribulations in his life that haunt him every step of his journey. He has so much personal trauma and so many emotional moments in this game that make him so lovable, and I just couldn't help but to root for him every step of the way. Even though Clive can turn into a semi-godlike being that can shoot fireballs, he's still just a human that wants to protect his loved ones. And he's constantly trying to find his purpose in life and what it truly means to live as a free man. Even when he has literally the burden of the world on his shoulders, he still goes out of his way to help the less fortunate people. And he goes through so many character arcs where he gets philosophical. Very often in the story, he's found wanting to find the meaning of his own life, pondering what it truly means to not just die on his own terms, but to live on his own terms. There are so many nuanced topics like this that are rarely brought up in video games, and 16 tackles them with grace. That's why I love the writing in this game. And not only that, but Clive is extremely talkative. Usually stoic characters like this are individuals of very few words, but instead he's actually very communicative. He always expresses his thoughts and feelings in way more than just one sentence or phrase. This is what Clive's Japanese script looks like physically next to his Japanese voice actor Yuya Uchida. And what's crazy about this is that Japanese is a very condensed language, yet the stack is this big, meaning that this would look much bigger if it were written in English. What I also really liked about Clive's English voice is the really gravelly tone that he has that reminds me a lot of Geralt from The Witcher 3. His voice is just really soothing to listen to due to the excellent English performance of Ben Starr, which just adds to the list of why Clive is such a great character all around. If there's one thing that I can count on CBU3 to deliver, it's the amount of effort they put into character writing and lore building, because they continue to just blow me away with how they handle such difficult topics tactfully. The story in 16 is simply amazing. I mean, of course I was expecting this game's story to be really good, as it was mostly written by the same development team that wrote the awesome stories for the FF14 expansions. I knew that I could trust CBU3 to deliver an engaging narrative that would captivate me the whole way through, and they did. Without getting into spoiler territory, the story of 16 follows the life of Clive Rosfield, who is the eldest son of the Archduke of Rosaria and the protector of his brother Joshua. After some treachery by their mother Annabella, the Duchy of Rosaria is wiped out and Joshua is killed by Ifrit. Clive is then captured and forced to be a soldier for 13 years of his life, only being fueled by the hope that he might one day avenge his brother's death. Meanwhile, the entire realm of Valisthea is in conflict with each other for what little remaining land they have left that's untouched by the Blight. I just love how there's so much political conflict behind the scenes that doesn't revolve around the main character. In fact, Clive is just a very small piece in this massive world. It makes this story much more believable, and it gives the team the chance to flesh out the other characters in the story. 16's world revolves around the idea of bearers, who are people born with the ability to use magic without crystals. But for some reason, bearers are looked down upon by society and are treated as subhumans, many of which are forced into slavery. Clive, of course, is deemed as a bearer for his magic affinity, and for 13 years of his life he was forced to be a disposable soldier whose life meant nothing. This bearer versus non-bearer dynamic leads to some really messed up stuff happening in this game, which made for some really interesting side quests. Now of course this is a Final Fantasy game, which means that there's going to be tons of dialogue and an insane amount of cutscenes. I think this game has a total of about 20 hours worth of cutscenes, which is crazy. So if you're the type of gamer who doesn't like to sit watching cutscene after cutscene back to back to back, then you probably won't like this game. I would say that about 60% of my 55 hours playing this game, I was in a cutscene, which would probably drive some people away after hearing that. I noticed a lot of times after I finished a 10-minute cutscene with one character, I would have to walk 5 feet and get into another 10-minute dialogue with another. And I do think that kind of slows down the pacing of the game, not to mention that sometimes the main quest can even slow down to a snail's pace. I get that they wanted to put some respite after the epic battles, but some of these quests do start to get repetitive and boring. For example, CBU3 really likes to do this thing where they make you go to a new settlement where you have to find some sort of influential person there and help them out. Then after you've helped them out, they give you their Pokemon Gym badge, which lets other NPCs know that you're one of them. It wasn't that big of a deal at first, but they just kept doing it over and over again. Like, was there no other way to progress the plot? It just seems kinda excessive after the 6th time doing it. I would have appreciated it if they mixed up the formula a bit from time to time. But other than some pacing issues and some boring cutscenes, I would say that the story is overall a really enjoyable experience with a bunch of emotional and personal moments from everyone in this wide cast of characters. and the story does a really good job of captivating me most of the way through with its interesting plot. This story is about as Final Fantasy as it gets, and I love it. The combat in 16 actually kinda suffers from an interesting dilemma. You see, the thing about this game's fully action combat is that since it was made for the mass casual audience, the skill floor of 16 is extremely low. You can pretty much get through this whole game just fine mashing square and spamming abilities off cooldown. There are even a bunch of accessibility options for the less able-bodied gamers, like the timely accessories that literally play the game for you. To add to that, the action-focused difficulty you get at the start of the game is not challenging enough for the seasoned players because enemies are still really weak and barely fight back. The devs really should have let us access the hard mode from the beginning, which I think would alleviate a lot of the complaints about difficulty. Everything in this game was made to be easy, and because of that, it doesn't really reward people for taking their time to learn how to do cool combo strings. And some of these game journalists are even complaining that the combat is so easy you can beat it with one hand. You can be just as effective in combat spamming square and dumping your abilities, and that's such a shame because this combat is so good. The skill floor might be extremely low, but the skill ceiling is on the moon. There is so much room here for skill expression that it's actually crazy what kind of combos some people can come up with. A lot of people will criticize this game's combat as being boring, but that just couldn't be further from the truth. If you take the time to practice juggling enemies and maximizing your damage during stagger phases, then you'll find that this combat is actually adrenaline rushing fun. It was such a good idea for them to bring the lead combat designer of Devil May Cry 5, Ryoto Suzuki, onto this game because he has such a good vision for what makes a fluid and satisfying combat system. The combo crafting options here are near infinite, and it sucks that a lot of people would never even want to touch the highest peaks that this combat is capable of because you simply don't need to. Sure, you can just spam square and ability dump off cooldown the whole game, but you'll end up having such a dull and repetitive experience. Instead of playing like this, you can be playing like this. This game is so satisfying when you're hitting the big stagger damage numbers like 80 to 100k damage regularly on bosses and killing them in one stagger phase. And what's cool about the combat is that you'll get these iconic abilities that you'll be able to use alongside your basic moves. Your sort of build in this game are the skills that you choose to bring with you in combat. The plethora of abilities you get are extremely diverse, allowing you to customize your loadout to your heart's content to best fit your playstyle. Although I do wish that you can use all of your abilities in midair, because the problem I have with them is that you can't use most of your abilities midair, and I find this to be extremely limiting the gameplay, as one of the coolest parts of games with action combat like Devil May Cry is seeing how long you can juggle enemies in the air. But that's more of a minor nitpick from me than a complaint. A lot of people also mention how there aren't any elemental weaknesses or status effects in this game. Using a fire spell on a fire monster does the same amount of damage, and getting hit by a Morble's bad breath doesn't give you any negative debuffs. And I do kinda agree with this. It does feel kinda weird having my spells do the same amount of damage to all enemies, but I can see why they chose not to do this, because it would be kinda annoying going against a fire enemy in the early game when you only have the Phoenix icon, and it would severely limit gameplay freedom if, let's say, a boss were only weak to the wind element, so you feel like you have to change your whole loadout for that one boss. I'm honestly fine with the way it is currently because the devs would have to rebuild the entire combat from the ground up to address this issue. As for the status effects, they probably felt like they were just unfun to play against. I don't know. But overall, the combat is really what you make of it because it's accessible to people of all skill levels. If you want to play the simple way using basic combos, you can do that. If you want to be stylish and pull off the coolest combos you can think of, you can do that. Either way, this combat can be shallow as a pond or as deep as an ocean depending on what you want to get out of it, and I think that's really cool. Anyway, the real stars of the show are the clash between the Eikons themselves because holy crap, they are cinematic spectacles. These Eikon fights are so absurdly wild that they throw out all semblance of realism in favor of just pure visual entertainment. Now, I can't show too much of these Eikon fights as that'll get into spoiler territory, but they're just crazy good looking fights that get more and more anime every time. This game goes from Japanese looking Witcher 3 to Godzilla with Dragon Ball Z powers, and it's awesome. I only wish that there were more of these Eikon fights in the game because I just wanted more of the pretty visual effects and flashy colors, but unfortunately they're only for the main story boss fights. Speaking of boss fights, I really enjoyed fighting all of the bosses in this game. The plethora of boss fights that 16 has are really fun. The story bosses of course were cinematic spectacles with many multiple different phases and attack patterns. The boss fights in 16 were the highlights of the game for me, honestly. I had so much fun with them. And there are these optional bosses called notorious marks that you can do from time to time that rank from C tier to S tier depending on their difficulty. These hunts were fun to do because they gave you really good rewards, and the harder S tier hunts were some of the most fun I had in this game. There was this one hunt that I did that was 12 levels higher than me, and it was some of the most intense moments I've had in 16. I was on the edge of my seat the entire time fighting this boss. Not gonna lie, it took me a few tries because this boss was doing so much damage to me, but once I eventually beat this dragon, it was the most cathartic feeling. Unfortunately though, that was basically the only time where I had this level of difficulty with the game, and that was because I was 12 levels under the boss. As I said before, this game's action-focused difficulty is really forgiving. There are 2 harder difficulty options above it that add more stronger monsters and packs and make their AI more aggressive, but it would have been cool if they gave us that hard difficulty option from the start because most of the game is really easy. I get that they're trying to appeal to a more casual audience, but I think they went a little overboard locking these difficulties to New Game Plus. Now undoubtedly, the weakest part of 16's gameplay has to be the itemization. It's just very bare bones with not that much depth to it. This game is supposed to be an RPG, but in reality it feels like it does the bare minimum to be considered one. It has stats on gear and damage numbers, but that's it. There's no build variety, no interesting itemization, or any party management whatsoever. It felt like CBU3 wanted to make a pure action combat game, but Square Enix wanted to have RPG elements in it because it's a Final Fantasy game and Final Fantasy needs to be an RPG. So the devs had to comply and put in the most basic itemization in order to please Big Daddy Square. You see, you have 3 slots for your armor and 3 slots for your accessories. The gear that you get for your armor slots are really all just stat sticks that increase either your damage or defense. You can also craft gear upgrades for your armor slots, but the upgrades are boring because they give you like +5 damage or something. There were no cool effects or different attacks you can do with them, they're all just purely stat sticks. The only thing I liked about it was that it changed the appearance of your weapon. The accessories, however, are slightly more interesting in this department because some of them actually give you unique effects that change the way you play the game. Like the Berserker ring that makes your precision dodges give you an attack buff and it makes them look really badass. Or the one necklace that auto charges your magic shot. Only some of the accessories are better, but even then, most of them just give you boring stat increases. Like some of the necklaces give -X cooldown to one specific skill, or 10% more damage to combos. Just more boring number increases. I feel like if this game removed its uninteresting crafting and gearing systems, then the experience would still pretty much be the same. Which sucks because I, as well as many other people, would have liked some more RPG integration like party management or weapons that affect your gameplay. But for what it is right now, it's just not very good. I cannot go through this whole review without even mentioning just how good the music is in 16. The music composer Masayoshi Soken has done it yet again and manages to create an absolute banger of an OST. If you've played 14, then you'll probably understand just how legendary Soken's music is in that game. And it's so cool seeing so many other people listening to his music for the first time and being captivated the exact same way. This soundtrack deserves all of the praise that it gets, and I wouldn't be surprised if it wins some awards at the Game Awards. From conquering cancer to conquering our hearts through music, this man is a treasure within the gaming industry, and I would do him a disservice by not mentioning just how many emotions he was able to stir within me with his music. The Final Fantasy XVI OST list is massive, with well over 200 different songs that all have their own musical themes and motifs. From the peaceful ambient tracks while you're exploring the lush forestry of Rosaria to the epic orchestral themes during boss fights. This game has such a wide variety of tracks that all fit amazingly well for the situations they're used in, and a lot of them pay homage to the older Final Fantasy soundtracks. Just listening to the orchestral battle music while you're fighting a boss straight up gives me the chills every time the choir chimes in. These different songs are tugging at my heartstrings every single time an emotional scene is happening or when there's an epic boss fight, and I love it. Overall, I really loved my time with Final Fantasy XVI. I know that many people are turned off by the many decisions CBU3 made for this game, but I think that this game is still amazing despite all of its flaws. The game looks absolutely beautiful with each area being extremely detailed. It has a really deep and well thought out world building with well written characters that feel believable. The story is genuinely really good and kept me glued to my screen the whole time. The combat is some of the most satisfying and visceral combat systems I would have never imagined I would experience in a Final Fantasy game, with the Eikon fights being such awesome cinematic spectacles. They were genuinely the biggest highlights of the game, and the soundtrack that's composed by Masayoshi Soken is genuinely a god tier soundtrack. Final Fantasy XVI has some of the highest peaks you could ever experience within the gaming medium, but unfortunately, to accompany the peaks are the dips, and 16 suffers from quite a few of them, like the lack of exploration rewards, a multitude of long and boring cutscenes, the lack of difficulty in combat, and a really bare bones gearing system. This game has a lot of really good qualities to it, but it also has a fair bit of bad qualities that can easily sour the experience of a lot of players. But as for me, I still loved every moment of this game. Now, is this game gonna win Game of the Year? Probably not. I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't with the absolutely stacked competition this year. That award will most likely go towards Tears of the Kingdom, and I'm completely fine with that. Final Fantasy XVI is Game of the Year in my heart, and I think that's what matters the most. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know down below and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more reviews in the future. See ya.